Break it down. Let's go. Money signal. Giddy up.
I love it. This is episode 3.
Episode 3
And
From Main Street to Wall Street.
Can't believe we're doing this. I mean, it feels surreal also, I think, because of the lights. Today, I want to talk about Wall Street.
Okay.
And the culture, the myths, the shifts, and in your life experience, basically how it has shifted. What I really want to get down to this episode is to hear more of your life story on Wall Street over these 4 decades, but also understand how the digital influence has changed trading. So again, AI, automation, computers,
right,
to influencers, because they obviously financial markets and economy have changed now with the creator economy and people like you,
right,
who influence stocks. Anything you say influences other people, and it influences
Correct.
the outcomes of companies. So this is what I want to talk about today.
Okay, I appreciate it. I love it.
Let's start off with, I'd love to hear more about when you started on Wall Street.
Okay.
So actually your journey to Wall Street.
Support for the show comes from BCX, the public ticker for private tech. For generations, American companies have moved the world forward through the ingenuity and determination. And for generations, everyday Americans could be a part of that journey
Through perhaps the greatest innovation of all, the U.S. stock market. It didn't matter whether you were a factory worker in Detroit or a
farmer in Omaha.
anyone could own a piece of the great American companies. But now that's changed.
Today, our most innovative companies are staying private rather than going public.
The result is that everyday Americans are excluded from investing and getting left further behind,
while a select few reap all the benefits. Until now. Introducing BCX, the public ticker for private tech.
BCX by Fundrise gives everyone the opportunity to invest in the next generation of innovation, including the
Companies leading the AI revolution, space exploration, defense, tech, and more.
Visit getvcx.com for more information. That's getvcx.com. Carefully consider the investment material before investing, including objectives, risks, charges, and expenses. This and other information can be found in the fund's prospectus at getvcx.com. This is a paid sponsorship.
Look, there's no better way than for me to really explain the differentiation between the culture that Wall Street was and Wall Street is, right? I mean, I don't think there's anybody really who, surely who's not as vocal and who is an influencer, who's around telling the story, who's somebody who's experienced Wall Street from the open outcry auction market of what people know of Wall Street, right? Screaming and yelling, and, the original Wall Street movie with Michael Douglas and Charlie Sheen, and, that open outcry environment and real auction market. I mean, the 80s. The 80s on Wall Street was extraordinary. I've been able to experience, every decade and every transition and every shift of culture that you describe from 85 until now, until 25. And, it's the shift is extraordinary. I mean, it could not be more broad, and I'm sure it's going to get broader. But, it's if you look at it through the eyes of a human, mm-hmm. right? Because so many businesses have been influenced by technology, right? And many of them are, humans have been outsourced, and humans are not really involved in businesses anymore, and the more the technology makes its inroads into the nooks and crannies of any business, advertising, the media, right, newspapers, it's before, I don't want to make myself feel old or look old, but there was a time when, there were only 8 TV stations, and the antenna on the TV was like a metal hanger from the closet, right? And you used to have to twist it to get for the station to come in clearly. And, there were no cell phones. You used to have rotary phones, and, there was no technology, and that, you walked around with a quarter in your pocket, to make a phone call, and I used to do business in phone booths, right? I mean, I used to carry around, depending on which me we're talking about, I always was a hustler. I was always doing stuff. I used to sell, T-shirts in high school and hang out at Grateful Dead shows, and, and do all kinds of businesses. I was always wheeling and dealing. And I would carry around a pocket full of quarters. And at any point, we had phone booths all over New York City. Like, not just outdoor ones, but you could open the door and get in there, and hang out for a while. There was a little table, and we used to like smoke cigarettes, and you'd be on the phone, you'd conduct business. It was like my office, and now there's literally only one phone booth left in New York City. We should go film from there because it's on my street. I actually did a post from it maybe a couple of months ago. But all that being said, I started my journey on, I can just give a little bit of a background of just, growing up, I have Eastern European parents. My parents are immigrants, came here in 1949. I was reminded of it yesterday because yesterday was a Holocaust Remembrance Day.
Oh.
And my parents are both survivors of the Holocaust. And so the stock exchange, there's a company called Fiverr, which everyone, of course, has heard of. And it's sort of a TaskRabbit company, publicly traded company, Israeli-owned publicly traded company. And they, and this holiday is obviously celebrated every year. We're getting down to the time where there are only a handful of survivors that are left, right? My father died, in 2019 at the age of 97. He was 18 during the war. My older brother, I had an adopted brother, who my father adopted during the war, who was 8 years old when my father adopted him in the camps, and he was 13 when he was liberated, and he just died, and he was 94. And so, those who are still alive, who are survivors, are probably they were 8, 9, 10 years old during the war. And so the CEO of Fiverr decided, I guess there's a group of Israeli tech companies, and it's quite a large organization, and they've all sort of pulled together, and they're trying to, battle anti-Semitism and stuff like that. And so they actually came to the stock exchange yesterday to commemorate. I wouldn't say celebrate. Celebrate's not the right use of the word, but to commemorate the anniversary, a 60-something year of the liberation of Auschwitz, which was the worst concentration camp. And Misha Kaufman, I believe is his name, an amazing guy. I got to meet him when I was there for the IPO. And the fun thing about Fiverr is that their sort of mascot is this giant bull. And when they went public, going public on the floor of the stock exchange now has become a very experiential experience. Right, and so every company that does it, like Figma had beautiful like floor jackets made up, and and Fiverr had these big bulls outside the exchange that were painted, fiberglass bulls, and they were painted. And so after spending 2 or 3 hours with Misha, because he was standing there during the whole price discovery process of going public, he and I became sort of friendly, and and I said to him, sort of jokingly, I said, I'd really love one of those bulls outside. It's about an 8-foot bull. It's giant, and he goes like, you live in New York, what would you do with it? I said, well, I said, I have a home up in the country, and there's a monument there that my father built to his family, and he spent 15 years building it. And it's beautiful. There are rocks there to commemorate the 6 million Jews that died. And I said, and I would put it there. You're an Israeli company, and I know your stance on and remembering the Holocaust and whatnot. And we sort of joked about it, and he said, "Oh, give me your address." And then, sure enough, 6 months later, I get a phone call from a moving company. They said, "We are in your driveway with a 8-foot bull in the back of the truck, and we're here to deliver this bull to you."
No way.
Yeah, and they delivered it, and I put it in the spot. And it's still there, and I ride it. I hop on the back of it every once in a while and shoot videos. And I had a beautiful, an artist who is a chainsaw artist, right? He cuts, makes beautiful art out of wood, out of trees that he cuts with a chainsaw. And so I had him make a 10-foot bear. So he cut a 10-foot bear out of a huge tree. And so I have the bull and the bear next to each other, and it's in my driveway. It's sort of in this sort of a cool area. So anyway, we were talking about yesterday they came to the exchange, and they brought a few of the survivors with them. And the exchange was sort of nice enough to ask me if I would interview one of them. The man who was being sort of honored is a gentleman named Nate, I don't remember his last name, who was 97 years old, incredibly with it. He had been honored by the exchange, and they brought him down. He rang the closing bell, and then they interviewed him, and then they asked if I would interview him, because obviously, my parents having grown up with that experience. Growing up the child of a survivor, it's not just a thing, it's a thing, right? It's a big part of my life, right? My parents had numbers branded on their arms. Every night, there was not one night where that was not the topic of conversation by the end of the evening, sitting at the dinner table about what they experienced. I'm not sure how I got off on this tangent, but anyway, so going back to, so I was starting to talk about how I was sort of wheeling and dealing, and so I, as a kid, I used to I was always doing some kind of business, and then, I got through high school, and in high school I got into, I was doing pottery, and then I was into agriculture, and after high school I graduated, spent a year in Israel. I lived on a kibbutz, and which was wonderful for me. It was a great year. It was me and 27 Norwegian women living on this kibbutz, so it was really tough. It was a tough life. I stayed there for a year. I ended up falling in love with a Norwegian lady who I didn't end up marrying, and I came back to the States, and I went to college, and my first degree I got in college was in agriculture, because I thought I was going to go back to Israel and work in agriculture. It was something I always loved, growing things and gardening and stuff like that. But it was not realistic. But I got a full degree in it. And then my older brother, who my father had adopted, who went on to become a multi-millionaire and big Wall Street M&A tycoon, really. He was sort of he was an adopted brother. He sort of was my mentor growing up, even though he was many, many years older than me. He's 30-something years older than me. And, everybody said, okay, enough is enough. It's time to, you're going to be a businessman.
Stop having fun.
Right, stop having fun. My father wanted me to be a doctor, and that was not my calling. And so my older brother, whose name was Harvey, said, it's time to go to business.
They were like, stop fooling around, Peter.
Put on your big boy pants. Let's get busy. So I ended up getting a degree in international business and finance, and then I graduated college. I moved back to New York, and that's kind of where my journey began, because it was, I was, by then, if I were to describe to you what I do in a day, kind of what I do in a day, it would tire most any normal human being. Already back then, I was going to Baruch at night, getting a master's in business. I was trading commodities during the day with a couple $1,000s that my older brother had given me. I just sort of taught myself how to trade orange juice futures and plywood and potatoes and stuff like that, and was successful at it for a little while until I lost it all in one day. I turned $1,500 into $45,000 and lost it just like that. And then I opened a record store on Bleecker Street in Lower Manhattan. This was 1980, and it was modeled after a European record store, and it was an African art gallery, and it was a record store, and it was a coffee shop. It was beautiful. And it was at 52 Carmine Street, and you walked in, it was just beautiful. There was art on the walls. It was an old sort of a Greenwich Village spot with beautiful brick.
That's so cool.
Yeah, it was wonderful. And we had listening booths like European record stores. You could listen to the record beforehand. It never made any money. It became the hangout of all the jazz artists. I started running a jazz management business. I was managing all these famous jazz musicians. I was managing the Village Vanguard, all the jazz clubs in New York. And then I did that for about a year and a half and then I was the doorman at Studio 54. Which was a famous club that has become renowned now. And so that was my life at the time. I did not sleep. I was up for a couple of years there. And then it was 1980, 81, 82-ish. Somebody came to me, my best friend actually, Norwegian guy, and he said, have you ever thought of closing the store? Because it's not making any money. And I said,
What do you mean? That's the hangout of all the
It's
jazz artists.
It's like it was a dream, but he was the one who was supporting me. So I went to the front of the store. I closed it, locked the store, and that was it. I shut that down. I did not graduate. I was short about 13, 14 credits in my master's. I lost all my money trading commodities, and I said, okay, time to move on. And so I ended up. This friend of mine, the Norwegian, was running an oil company in West Africa, in the People's Republic of Benin. And so it was time to get out of town. And so I went and moved to West Africa for a year and a half. And so that was just the beginning of computers, right? Computers were not even out yet. The first inkling of a computer was this thing called Lotus 123. Mm-hmm. It was the first spreadsheet, right? Computers were these big clunky things, and nobody knew what to do with them. There was no internet for sure. And so I studied. He said, you're coming to be in West Africa with me, and you're coming in as a computer specialist, so you better learn it and become one very quickly. So fortunately, the flight to West Africa is 18 hours. So I had plenty of time to read the book. And so I read the book, the Lotus 123 book. By the time I arrived, I was a computer specialist. I just moved right into my job, and I was teaching everyone there how to build, do spreadsheets and stuff. It was very basic, but and then what I was doing was it was a communist dictatorship at the time, mm-hmm. And so the dictator of the country was taking the oil that the Norwegian company was exploiting from the ground, from the ocean actually, and he was stealing all of it basically. And so what I did was I would tell him how many barrels a day he was taking and then how much money it was worth. That was my spreadsheet. So I did that. I mean, that's a story. That's in a podcast all on its own. I had an amazing experience in West Africa. I became initiated into a voodoo cult. I did. We built chicken farms for all the villages. I mean, we had an amazing time there. And then after it was 1985, it was like my parents called me up and said, you know what? You've overstayed your welcome there, and it's time to put on your big boy pants. And my older brother said, you're going to Wall Street. And I said, okay. And so I came back to the States, and I got a summer job on Wall Street. My father had a patient. He was a well-known doctor. And he had a patient who was a partner at Cowan and Company, which was a brokerage firm on the floor, and right under the podium. And it was soon, many years later, was taken over by Société Générale, mm-hmm. a French bank. And so I got a summer job there on March 28th, 1985. It was my first day. It was the day that Ronald Reagan rang the opening bell or the closing bell. Oh. I didn't even know that was happening. I was so overwhelmed by my new job. And my job was basically when orders would come down from upstairs to buy or sell stock, they were called down from the trading desks to the clerks on the floor. And we would stand there in front of trees of phones. It was back in the day where you'd have these black phones, and then you'd have these buttons that you would push, and it would change what line you were on. And we must have had 40 or 50 lines. And you would just stare at the phone, and you just hit these buttons, and you'd go, yeah, buy 500,000. Yeah, buy 200. And you were just sort of screaming and yelling. You never looked away. You just spaced the phone, the bank of phones. And then, so the brokers would go out, execute stock. The order would come back. It would be reported over the phone to the desk. And then the person would hand me a piece of paper that said, you bought 5,000 shares of XYZ at $274.30. We were trading in eighths and quarters back then. Mm. So it was either a quarter, it was eighths and quarters, a quarter, 3/8, a half, 5/8, 3/4.
Why was that?
7/8.
Why was the trading?
Well, trading
different?
Originally was always done in eighths and quarters, mm-hmm. going back to the beginning of time. You traded, there was an eighth, a quarter, 3/8, a half, 5/8, 3/4, 7/8, the figure. That was how you traded stock. It was traded in 12-cent intervals. Okay, and so it was just the way things were done. And then later on, it went to nickels and pennies. Right now, we trade in pennies. But anyway, so I would input into this big clunky teletype machine the executed order that you bought 200,000 shares of XYZ, whatever, and it would go up to it would be sent up to the customer, to the brokerage firm. Then I would take all the paper, all the different orders. I would hand them to the tube guy. So you have to realize on the floor of the stock exchange, there was a whole caste system. There were 8,000 people on the floor. There was a whole support staff that, in the old days, without any technology, everything was done by hand on paper, screaming and yelling. It was just like human to human. And so, there was everything. So everybody had a purpose. So you had squads. There were the people in the little blue jackets who made $40 a week, and they were the schleppers back and forth. In the crowd, if you had to get information from the trading crowd to the booth, you raised your hand, you screamed squad. Person would come running up. They'd take the paper, run it to the booth. They'd get more information and then run it back. They were runners, basically. That was the lowest rung of the thing. Everybody who went on to become multimillionaires and brokers and traders and all that started as a squad.
Wow.
There was no training for the job. Everybody who came there, didn't matter what your background was, you started at the bottom and you worked your way to the top. I never was a squad, but I was one step up. I was a teletypist. And then normally it took 13 to 15 years to go from squad or teletypist to be broker. Right? In 1903, they issued something like 1,366 seats on the stock exchange when they opened up the NYSE, and that gave you the right to trade stock. It was called a seat on the stock exchange. It was incredibly exclusive position. It was there was a limited number of them, so you had to really work hard, and somebody had to either quit, retire, or die before you got that seat, because it was like a taxi medallion. The price of a seat, which gave you the right to trade stock, was based on how hot the economy was, how hot the market was. Throughout my career, and you were not allowed to buy a seat with other people's money. You had to buy the seat with your own money. So you couldn't borrow money from your parents to buy a seat. You had to have it yourself. So I was never able to buy one throughout all my career. Wow. I almost had one a number of times, but people knew it was every penny I had and they outbid me. So when I got there, a seat was trading at around $80,000, and it went on to trade for as much as $8.5 million when they went public. And so, which was unbelievable. So anyway, everything started from scratch. That's how you worked your way up. But anyway, so that was my beginning, and I was very lucky. I went from teletypist to option clerk to retail clerk to institutional clerk to broker. I did it in 3.5 years. I got there in 85. I had my first seat in April of 88, right? Because I was lucky. I was in the right place, right time. I was good at what I did, and I did it much quicker than most people. But along the way, that's where you pay your dues. You had to get to know people. People had to get to know you. It was all a matter of trust. You never transact money, right? It's all a matter of your word is your bond. That's how Wall Street works. And so that was sort of your initiation, right? And that's why it used to take so long normally to do, because it took a while to basically initiate yourself into this industry. People needed to know who you were and trust you. If they're going to give you an order that's worth millions and hundreds of millions of dollars, I mean, I traded hundreds of millions of dollars on any given day. They needed to know who you were, right? You needed to be bonded by the FBI. You needed to, they needed to know who you were in and out. And so, so that was the beginning of my journey, right? And and look, so that was probably from 1903 until 1985, or even probably another 10 or 15 years after that, until the late 90s. That's how Wall Street ran. It was open outcry. It was screaming and yelling. It was human beings, right? There was this support system, right, from the tube. So the last thing I'll say is that, so when I was done with the order and I typed it in, I would hand it to the tube guy. The tube guy would take all the paper orders, roll them up, and put them in a little plastic thing, and then send them in a pneumonic tube, an air tube, upstairs to the 17th floor, where there was a whole floor of ladies. It was the only place where women were on Wall Street, and they would be inputting it into a computer, an early computer, and create the ticker tape. And that's how, and that ticker tape went all over the world.
Oh, wow. First and foremost, I don't even know where to start from. There are so many things that you mentioned that I want to deep dive in. I almost feel like we could just have conversations for hours.
We could. It's a great
but-
long story.
That brings me back to one of the first times when we met, I said, wow, that was my first time at New York Stock Exchange, and it's so quiet.
Yep.
It's because of that. Everything that you just described is what I had seen on movies, right? So
Correct.
I'm a kid in Bulgaria, movies are playing, you hear Wall Street, I immediately would associate that to almost like this mayhem and chaos, people yelling, screaming.
And it was
money.
real, and that was real. That's how it was every day, from bell to bell. It was like thoroughbred horse off to the races. The people who were on the floor were not people who got to wake up and have a coffee and read the paper and slowly get going. This was like out of the gate. You needed to be ready to go. You ate your lunch over a garbage can, a bite at a time. I mean, there was that was how things went. And you needed to be on call. You needed to be in it. It was all about trust and transparency and communication and being able to really work with other people in a very tight setting because it was wall-to-wall people, right? And, it was like Irish, Italians, and Jews who had come down to the floor in the early part of the century. They started out at the bottom of the rung and they moved their way up. Wonderful rags to riches stories of the guy who was like the barber or the guy who was shining shoes, who
Right.
somebody picked up as a clerk and he went on to become a multimillionaire. I mean, great stories like that.
The American dream.
The American dream. I mean, so much of Wall Street was like that because nobody came there with any. I probably had more, having gone to college and had somewhat of a master's degree, I had more education than almost everybody down there because many of them never went to college, right? And back in those days, right?
Yeah.
You just came down there. But the last thing I'll say is what was fun about it also was everybody had a hustle. So on the floor of the stock exchange, you could buy anything from pantyhose to diamond rings to caviar to anything, right? Everybody had a shtick, right? I was the guy that you went to for caviar, for food, for medical stuff, because my father was a well-known doctor. And I think maybe a couple of other things, but everybody had their thing. And then there were all the different jobs. There was a squad, there was a teletypist, there was a clerk, there was a reporter, there was a tube guy, there was someone who was putting on the original blockchain, the person who was putting on all the trades, right? Because it took 7 days before we cleared the trades. So you needed to be able to go back and identify every second what traded, how many shares, who did it, what your badge number was,
Yeah.
and all that kind of stuff. So in the midst of all this chaos and mayhem, it was very organized because it had to. It was about billions of dollars.
That's crazy. I did not know that it took that long, but now it all makes sense. I mean, from the chaos and mayhem to basically late 80s, early 90s is when really technology started coming along.
Even a little later. I don't think it happened that. I don't know the particular day, but I don't think we got any technology until early 2000s. The first thing that we got that was any kind of technology was a Palm Pilot. A Palm Pilot was this little handheld thing that looked like the early cell phone, and it was a thing that you used a little stylus, and people used it. It was an early computer, really, and they would type. You would use it as a phone, right? But it was just a way of communicating, and you stored information. And in those days, the first time we had any technology used to buy and sell stock was on this little Palm Pilot. So if you Google Palm Pilot, you'll see, and that was the earliest part of technology. And then as it slowly grew, but that wasn't until early, like 2005, 2006.
And when did I was talking to one of the guys on the floor, and he said that back in the day, I don't know which day, what year, what decade that was, there was the big board right above the podium,
right,
where you would see your number.
I can tell.
And then you would run and get the order, go execute.
So early on, when I got there, we used to have beepers. It was the age of beepers, right? And so we would have you'd wear a beeper, and you'd have your number in all the different booths, and they would beep you to give your orders. I was what was called a $2 broker. But way back, before there was even that kind of technology, if you needed to get the attention of a broker, behind the podium where they ring the bell was this massive board and everybody's badge number. So every seat on the stock exchange has a number associated with it. My number is 588. That was a number given to me 39 years ago. My son's number is 100 because his name is Benjamin, so he's a Benny. But they gave you your number. And so back in the old days, there was a board there with little wooden slats
connected to a string. And if they needed to get your attention, they would go over to the numbers guy, and they would say, "Could you put up badge 588?" And he would pull the string, the number would flap, and you needed to keep your eye on that board, and that meant that somebody was trying to get your attention. And then so you would see your number flapping. When you walk in the exchange now in the morning,
Yeah.
when you walk in, that's past the security. There's an old one of those flaps there, so you can
I've
actually
seen
see
it.
what it looked like. And
I
that was like
see.
early stuff. That goes way back.
That's crazy. And what did you guys get? The iPads? Is that
iPads started to happen probably in late 2000s.
Okay.
After financial crisis. I think the financial crisis we were trading on sort of an iPad, but not that advanced.
So when did, in your opinion, when was that point when mayhem became the silent, organized?
Still there was
Adrenaline.
noise and there was screaming and yelling, but we lost all of that probably mid 2000s. When we went literally from what was called open outcry and auction market. Best scene in that original movie with Michael Douglas and Charlie Sheen, where I'm actually in that scene where they're screaming and yelling, trading stock.
Pause. You are?
Yeah. I was there. I was a clerk.
Defined.
I was a clerk, and they were talking about Blue Star Airlines. If you go watch that, that's the greatest Wall Street movie of all time. That you have to see. It was the story of a guy who offered me a job. In reality, the day before he was indicted for the biggest insider trading scandal of all time. His name was Ivan Boesky. And Ivan Boesky claimed that he was having premonitions, that in the middle of the night he was hearing voices that was telling him what stocks to buy. But in fact, he had a guy upstairs at Goldman Sachs who was a criminal and who was giving him inside information. And so he was buying stocks right before they were going to be merging. So the RJR Nabisco takeover, which was the great cigarette company, and Beatrice, which was the orange juice company, these were all deals that he knew about, and he was buying millions of shares with the knowledge that he had inside information. And so he offered me a job. He worked right next to me, and he actually offered me a job on a Friday. I was making $25,000 a year, and he offered me a job making $80,000. And I finally said, somebody sees my value. Somebody knows how great I am. And I asked my father, and he goes, "Beware of money. I don't trust it. You may be great, but you're not that great," he said.
Yeah.
And so he said, wait on it. Wait till Monday. And I was like, I was 26 years old, and I was all
to
full
make
of
some money.
vinegar and all that. And I said, okay, I'll wait till Monday. And then Saturday morning, he called me, he said, "Turn on the TV." And it says Ivan Boesky indicted for the largest insider trading scandal of all time. He was fined $183 million. And he ended up going to prison for probably 4 or 5 years. And so that's what that movie was about. And that was classic old insider trading, just getting information before other people did. That was great.
Again, this is all so many exciting things that I've never read about you or learned anything.
Yeah, no, it's a wonderful part of my life. I mean, it's suddenly, I remember it well. It feels really real to me now. I mean, the transition from that period to this technology time, there are parts of it that are just sort of a cloud and a memory. But I would give anything to go back to the way that was.
Well, that's so sweet. And funny enough, I actually think you answered one of my husband's questions.
Which was
what movie describes best Wall Street?
The original. It's called Wall Street. It was that movie. And I think then they made a second version of it. And then those are the only movies that really, really describe Wall Street back in those days. Mm-hmm. You obviously have The Wolf of Wall Street, which sort of describes some of the culture, with drugs and alcohol and, the madness that went on in another era, a little bit later down the road. But yeah, Wall Street, the original movie, that was just extraordinary. It showed the elegance, during the movie, he gives a speech. His name was Gordon Gekko in the movie, and he gives a speech. And Charlie Sheen played the kid who goes out to try and impress this big multimillionaire by getting inside information. Uh-huh. And then eventually he realizes that that just being a liar and a cheat is not going to get you anywhere. And that's Wall Street. That's the thing about Wall Street. You get one shot to be honest. Right? And you screw that up once, you're gone for life. And we've seen that with the Jordan Belforts of the world, the Ivan Boeskys of the world. Your word is your bond. Mm-hmm. And if you can't live up to that, that's why we are rigorously regulated and there's no place for any funny business down there.
Yeah, and that's why you're still there 40
That's
years
why I'm
later.
still there 41 years later.
Well, here's a fun fact for you. I went to Baruch College as well.
Stop, yes.
Yeah, I did my master's. That was a few years later
But you
than
finished it, I'll bet. You're more of a finisher than I am.
I finished it. There
Yeah.
were other reasons. I came to the States as an international student, so I had to finish it, wanting or
course you
not.
did. Yeah.
And then another fun fact is that the first creator of the computer is John Atanasov.
Right.
He is Bulgarian.
No way.
There you go.
The
So,
inventor of the computer.
The inventor of the
Wow.
computer. Yes, modern computer.
1980, well, he started it before that, but surely, 1983 was the first experience I had with it, and I think it probably, it was not that sooner, much sooner than that, the computer started.
Yeah. Well, this has been. I'm going to have.
Yeah.
I
We're
wanna
gonna have a
talk
whole lot
about
of fun with this.
influencers. I want to
This
talk
is
about.
just a big story.
Yeah. There's just so many things, but as always, it's a pleasure hearing.
There, you know
it
what?
From you.
It's just from going. We have our lives. We find a journey, and we find a career. And as I always say, it's not my line, but it's a great line. If you find something you love to do, you'll never work a day in your life. For me, 40 years later, it's for me every day is going to work is like being in the Super Bowl. So, yeah,
Very cool. And it's a
Great.
pleasure to watch you from the sidelines.
it's
Well,
a pleasure
thank
talking
you.
about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can't wait for the next episode already.
Yes.
This is the Money Signal podcast.
Money Signal.
From
Giddy up
Main
on that.
Street to Wall Street.
Thank you,
with
my dear.
Peter Tuchman
Woo!
and Tsvetta. Woo!
Thank you.